Are allies too powerful? We're going to answer that question and more in this video, but first of all, I'm going to break down why allies are so strong. I think this will be mostly interesting for newer players, but I think experienced players will enjoy the discussion as well. So what are the main benefits of allies? Well, I think when most people think of why allies are really strong, they just think of defending with them, chump blocking, defending on preferably their last hit point, and that will just eat an entire villain attack, and you move on. And that is really good, and we will talk about that. But I just think that is the tip of the iceberg. I think even if allies didn't have that ability, they would still be the most powerful type of card in the game. And I think they are extraordinarily efficient. Just, cost to output ratio, what they do, super versatile because, they can do everything. They also offer banked output and make you almost invincible. And that bottom point, yeah, is mostly about them defending. But this is really some kind of interesting stuff to talk about, I think. First of all, let's talk about the anatomy of an ally. They have a cost, they have thwarting, they have attack, there's some hit points, and while some allies have multiple consequential damage, most of them by far only take one consequential damage each for thwarting or attack, and so on. If I attack for one with Maria Hill, she takes one consequential damage. That takes, her hit points down to half. So she has 2 uses. Allies with 3 health typically have 3 uses, and so on. And to top it all off, on top of this sort of output, the ability to thwart, attack, or defend, they have an ability, which is typically a response to entering play, maybe a passive effect, but it could be anything. And those are generally quite powerful when added on top of the rest. And I'm going to focus on the thwarting for now. Let's ignore Maria Hill's response here. What happens if you play her and she thwarts twice, use all her hit points up on thwarting? Well, she removes full threat, and that is just like for Justice, and that is incredibly powerful. Any deck that takes a basic ally, or maybe has their own ally with 2 thwarting, can basically replicate for Justice, a very good Justice card. This came with a core set, but it's still incredibly strong. It is not necessarily the best card for any situation, but it's always a good card for whatever situation, and that is where the power lies. For Justice is extremely versatile. So allies which can also attack and block and things, that can also be just as versatile as for Justice. That's such a strength for any ally with 2 thwarting. Any ally with 2 thwarting is a baseline just good in most circumstances, especially at 2 cost or 3 cost, but they draw you a card, so they're kind of effectively 2 cost, that kind of thing. It's very, very powerful. Now, for Justice and events in general are more immediate. I can get that 4 threat removal immediately on that turn, whereas with allies, I need to use them. Now they're exhausted, I have to wait for them to ready up, and then in the next turn, I can thwart again. But there is some power in that, especially in solo play, because quite often the main scheme might not have enough threat on to efficiently, use all of the Justice's threat removal. If there's only 2 threat on the main scheme, suddenly Maria Hill, ignoring her response, which is very good, suddenly any 2 thwart ally is going to be more efficient because I'm wasting less. So there is power in being able to split up where those, small increments of threat removal go. So let's look at a few more allies like this. So Daredevil in Protection is one of my favorite protection allies. And, thematically, maybe he doesn't fit everywhere or, anywhere I put him. But 2 cost, 2 thwarting. Yes, he's got 2 consequential damage, but he's got 3 hit points. So I can play Daredevil, thwart for 2, and then next turn, thwart for 2. When I'm playing a protection deck and I play Daredevil, yes, I do consider blocking with him, and sometimes, especially in multiplayer, I will. It depends what kind of protection deck. But I always, in my head, I'm like, okay, I've got a 2-part for Justice on the board as protection. That's really strong. And it's allies like this. We've also got Brother Voodoo here, who, yeah, he's 3 cost, but he gives you a card back. So, it's basically 2 cards that you've really spent on him. These allies with 2 thwarting in Protection are what, in my opinion, really raise Protection above aggression for solo viability and just general versatility. It's very, very strong. In Protection, don't be afraid if you struggle with threat removal, just throw a bunch of allies in there. Maybe it's not that interesting, but in terms of power, which is mostly what this video here is about, it is extremely, extremely good. But what about damage? Well, let's look at 3 cost instead of 2 cost, or 3 cost and card draw allies now. And these are just a few that, yeah, I picked up because they're high damage, but I didn't spend long finding them. I just scrolled through Marvel CDB and like, oh, this one, this one, this one. Gold Balls has 1 attack, but when you use his interrupt, he basically gets 4 attack with 3 hit points. He is 12 damage for a 3 cost card. That is absurd. Colossus, yeah, he's 4 cost, but if you play them, with a mutant or X-Men trait on your hero, which is basically the only time you consider using him really, he's 3 cost. Well, if you use his tough up to absorb his double consequential damage, then you attack again and again, 9 damage, exactly the same as X23. And getting this kind of damage for this kind of cost just eclipses basically all the events in the game. What's incredible is that, you don't need any setup. There's no hone technique necessary. It's just incredibly good raw value. It does take a few turns to pay off, That is the big downside here, and I'm aware of that. But how many minions, have 9 damage? Normally you can afford to, put 3 or 4 damage somewhere. Normally that's actually enough to take out a lot of minions. And then the next turns, you have this damage ready on the board, and that's just so strong to have. And unless you are really trying to rush and finish the game immediately that turn, there's a very little downside to having a good amount of damage that will take out a minion or most of a minion, and then getting a bunch more on the next turn and the following turn. The value is so incredibly high. If you think, oh, I just picked some kind of recent allies in the last few X-Men expansions, well, check out these guys. We have Valkyrie, Spider-Man, and Hawkeye. And Valkyrie and Hawkeye do need minions. Hawkeye does need plural, but the value here ends up looking like this if you go all in for damage. 9 damage, 8 damage, and 11 damage. The asterisk just kind of refers to them needing minions. It's a bit more conditional than some of the other characters we just looked at. But nonetheless, this is extremely high, and this is kind of across the board here, except maybe Justice allies, but it's still not terrible. And we can then take all these numbers, the 9, the 8, the 11, the 12, and if I squish these up on the left side of the screen, and then show you some of the attack cards. Basically, every 3-cost attack card and aggression, 1 from Justice, it looks a bit like this. This is the total damage you'll get across, 3 turns maybe with the allies. But then immediately in 1 turn, this is what you get from the events. And is the difference worth it? Well, in my opinion, generally it isn't. And I think that's actually why they printed Hone Technique for aggression, to try and bring these attacks up to be more competitive and more useful. And Hone Technique does bring them up a lot, maybe not way like that is the Justice event. But the downside is you need to play this upgrade with a sizable resource requirement, and then spend the right resource on all these events going forward. You have to play an upgrade. It's conditional on certain resources, and then its effect is conditional just to match baseline allies. Now, again, the immediacy does have value. I can't stress it enough. It is valuable to have all the output at once, but it's also valuable to be able to split it up. So, I don't think it's as much of a difference as you might expect. Now let's talk about defense, because I've mentioned blocking with allies quite a bit. Well, Mockingbird is one of the original characters in the game. I should say Mockingbird. She's from the core set, this ally, and she stuns the enemy, then she can thwart twice, then you could exhaust the block with her on her last hit point. That's 2 attacks and 2 thwarting for a 3-cost card. You will not find this from events generally in the aspect. It's just really, really, really ridiculously good. But we can go to the other side of the spectrum and look at Clear, who is 2-cost ally with basically the smallest stats possible. 1 thwarting, 1 attack. I guess it could be like 0 thwarting, 1 attack with 0 and 0, but generally it's very hard to find an ally without, stats better than this, unless they have some kind of other really good effect printed on the card. So you'll play Clear, you'll maybe thwart for 1, then block with her. It's still good. The most baseline, uninteresting, low output ally is still generally really, really good, because it's just an efficient way to block. How much would you pay for a stun or a tough card? You kind of have to imagine, in my opinion, speaking mechanically and in terms of power, allies are basically walking tough cards with some arms. They can put out some thwarting or some damage, or maybe they have a cool ability. But they are, at the end of the day, you can just exhaust them when an attack is coming towards you. And in 90% plus of circumstances, it might as well be a tough card for all intents and purposes. And that is really, really strong. And if you look at the way toughs and things are costed, at their most efficient in the aspects, they are basically 1 cost, which is 2 effective resources. If I had 5 cards in hand and I wanted to play a 1-cost card, I have to pay for it with another one. 2 cards are going. Every card is a resource, 2 effective resources. So every ally, basically 2 of the effective resources you pay, effectively a 1-cost card kind of thing, might as well be a tough card in my opinion. And those cards I'm talking about in the aspects are typically conditional, like Perseverance on changing forms, or Shake It Off on taking damage and being a Guardian. So allies are non-conditional, super efficient, tough cards, baseline, and then they've got a couple of uses and abilities on top of that, which just pushes up their value. And it's really very, very good. A typical cheap 2-cost ally probably has 2 attack, 1 thwarting, 2 hit points. And even that compares very favorably to the best kind of aspect cards you can find. Let's look at Spider-Girl here on the right. So Skilled Strike gives you 2 damage for 0 cost, 1 effective resource. Perseverance gives you a tough card for 1 cost, 2 effective resources. Combined Skilled Strike and Perseverance are 3 effective resources. Spider-Girl is also 3 effective resources, 2 cost. You can play her, attack for 2, giving you the damage of Skilled Strike, then you can block a whole attack, giving you all the defensive value of Perseverance. Except she's also got this response ability, which could, stun and confuse a minion, which isn't super amazing, but it can be really useful. And she's also got one thwarting, so in a pinch, you can thwart with her instead. She's only taking up one slot in your deck, giving you more room to bring more stuff. And it's just incredibly good. Like, you could just attack with her twice for 4 damage. That's still good. So versatile. And yet, even just going with exactly what we get from Skilled Strike and Perseverance, saying it's, rigid in terms of that, she can do what they do, but it's not conditional. You don't have to add her attack onto a basic attack, but I could basic attack then attack with her. I don't have to change form to get a tough card with Spider-Girl, but I could change form and still play her, and effectively she will serve as a tough. And I can just keep her around for a long time. An encounter card makes me take damage. It's not going to pop the tough or anything, whereas Spider-Girl will sit around. Incredibly efficient blocks, incredibly flexible. It's really kind of crazy, and it's really good. And if you were struggling with losing 2 damage in scenarios, maybe you just want to bring a couple more allies. There are plenty of thematic ones at this point for basically every character. Every hero can bring something thematic to block with. So hey, well, that's good. A lot of people don't like to block with allies because it doesn't feel very heroic, and I would agree, but it is what it is. In terms of power, blocking with allies is phenomenal. If we take the efficiency of, allies actually having their last use, preferably being a tough status card, blocking a whole attack, and there are differences. Again, this tough card, I'd say, is generally better because there are overkill mechanics and things, scenarios that punish allies now, when you block with them, but they're still fairly few and far between, and allies still have all the other benefits mostly against those scenarios, so But most scenarios, taking allies as a tough card. I could go back to my previous chart, for the damaging, allies, and it looks a bit like this. The top leftmost, 1 tough and 8 damage, that is gold balls, attacking for 4, and blocking. That is incredibly efficient. I've added on a new card on the attacks here. I guess I should have said before, into the phrase a bit different because it removes threat, so it can be more efficient. But at the bottom here, 1 tough and 4 damage. If there's a minion around, that's for the asterisk. That's hard knocks, that's a protection event. You get double the damage, and you don't have to rely on a minion being around with gold balls and aggression. That's crazy. And I should say gold balls does discard cards to get that damage. But if you bring Digging Deep and White Fox, which a lot of decks will with him, especially if it suits the character, I think it has a bit of, offset value. And it's still, even if you don't run Digging Deep with him, he's still incredibly good. Go through the rest of the allies that I had. I can't even remember which is which, honestly. But this is kind of how it maths out. The 2 toughs is Colossus, because you could use him to block twice and still get free damage out of him. It's just extraordinarily favorable compared to what the events offer when you break it down like this. Allies get more valuable in general when you use their last hit point to block. Actually, I'd say gold balls with 4 damage, it kind of maybe evens out. 4 damage for a tough is kind of a good exchange. It's just incredible value. The long story short here is that the cost of allies is not equivalent to the crazy good output you get for allies, and then they're super versatile. Yeah, attacking with Maria Hill, it's not as efficient as thwarting, but I have that option. There are not many thwarting events at all in the game, especially not in the aspects, where I can choose to deal damage instead. And yeah, maybe it's a bit less efficient, but at least I had that option. That just doesn't exist for events, and it really isn't there much for upgrades, which I've not talked about a lot here. This has really covered my first 2 points I wanted to make. They're so efficient and very versatile, but we haven't really talked about banked output, and I haven't talked about how they really make you invincible yet, because yeah, I could block with an ally, but what if I don't have an ally? Well, consider this. I put a bunch of allies in my deck, and I play a bunch of allies, and now I have like 3 allies on the table. If we get to the villain phase and I get extra attacks on top of their normal attack, well, I can block their normal attack and 2 additional attacks if I have 3 allies on the table. That villain cannot hit me. I can also just exhaust to defend. Maybe I've got a stun in place beforehand as well. These allies kind of stack up with anything else you want to do. They're just there if and when you need them. And yeah, sure, if I play them and don't use them, I've lost tempo, I've not got immediate value. But if I needed immediate value, I would just use them. So the flexibility in that regard is also crazy. But generally, if you have 3 allies out, you can take anything from the villain. Maybe if you're in solo play and advance comes up, good luck. But generally speaking, multiplayer, and aside from that happening, you are absolutely fine here. What about encounter cards? What if my encounter card is not an extra attack? What if a really nasty minion comes out? What if I have these 3 allies on the board? And these are just 3 I've kind of picked randomly. I guess they're X-Men, X-Force ones that I had in my head. But you could get similar stats on the board with any hero, pretty much from any aspect, honestly. And if a bad minion comes up, I don't even need to look at my 5 cards or my hero stats. I can attack with Deadpool, Angel, and Marrow, or I don't know, Quake, Dazzler, stuff like that, and even Justice. I can get 6 damage. I can basically take out that minion almost no matter what. There are obviously some exceptions, but most minions in the game, I didn't have to look at my hand, didn't have to use my hero. Gone. What if a side scheme comes out? Let's just talk in solo play because they scale a lot, but they're still useful in multiplayer. But in solo play, most side schemes won't have more than, I don't know, 4 to 6 threat at the top. Some just have 2 to 3. If I just fought with all of these 3 allies, that's 4 threat removed. That is that side scheme probably dealt with, especially if I combine it with my hero. So whatever the encounter card is going to be, I have a solution already banked on the board. I have got the output that I need to deal with problems, and it can solve anything. And there are allies with better stats than these. There are allies with better thwarting, you can get access to, relatively easily. Maybe not for aggression in terms of thwarting, but, long story short here is if you play lots of allies, you are getting more bang for your buck in terms of resources than most other cards. You're getting more versatility. And since they're more valuable, you can normally keep up the tempo with the scenario, and then still have, uses of these allies left over for subsequent encounter cards, which are just getting you more and more ahead of the game. And you are basically ready for anything, can play ahead, can go into the encounter phase knowing you're basically completely safe and can deal with anything. And yeah, it's really, really, really good. So are allies too powerful? That is a question. And again, not all of these examples have been absolutely perfect. I've kept them a bit simpler just to keep the video length down. I have tons and tons of asterisks and small things we could go into, but generally they're extremely good for threat removal, extraordinarily good for blocking, and still very, very good for damage, especially if you pick the right ones, of which we're starting to get quite a few of now, honestly. If you have the full deck building collection, you're in a great place. And a lot of the time when the topic comes up that is something too powerful, a lot of the time the response is, it's a cooperative game, you can just play solo, it's not competitive, you can choose not to use the powerful stuff, it's fine. And in general, I do agree with this, but I also disagree. I feel like that part of the game that it's not competitive lessens the, downside of things being too powerful, but I still think it is a kind of a downside. I think that allies being so powerful can drive players toward them, and that's not necessarily the best for, variety in the game. And you can just choose not to, but the game says play a hero, defeat a villain. You're going to try and build your deck to defeat villains. It's going to push you maybe toward more allies than the designers perhaps imagined when they first designed the game. That's kind of a slight assumption, but they are constantly putting out things to try and punish allies, which, I think we all know what's kind of going on here. I think there are downsides. You can talk about the power of a hero and how to make them work. And, someone can say, oh, just throw 10 allies into their aggression deck, and it's going to help them a lot. And technically, yeah, it's going to be powerful, but I don't think it's necessarily that interesting. And I think as a community kind of, that can be slightly disheartening to me to say, oh yeah, just fix it with 1 million allies. And I'm slightly guilty of this. I've posted a lot of decks, mainly before I had a YouTube channel. There's quite a large number of allies in quite a few of those decks, not as many as I guess some recent, popular decks, but people used to, criticize me a lot, especially behind closed doors. Why are you putting so many allies in here? Well, it's because if someone plays my deck, especially if they're not familiar with how it works, because I made the deck and posted it, and I like quite complicated decks, allies kind of cover everything, so just having a good amount of those in there, allies will save the day, they'll have a good, consistent experience, and yeah, it's good, it's powerful, allies strong. So I kind of think that they are a little bit too good. If I could go back in time, I'd love to just nudge them all down slightly at a base level, because no other card can basically do everything and do it extremely efficiently, and also be banked up on the board for a future turn. What if I could play an event and just set it aside and then trigger it on a subsequent turn? That would be crazy. That would be extremely powerful. So can we fix it? Because to some degree, I feel like allies are a Pandora's box. It's been opened and you can't get it back in. But I think there are little things we can do. And like I say, you can just choose to use less allies. And if you use allies all the time, hey, I recommend it. Try out some of the events you don't normally use. Try and lean into those. And I think it'll be really, really fun. Now, this is a pretty tricky topic, so tricky, in fact, my face has disappeared. To tell you guys the truth, this is Villain Theory from the future. I'm editing the video right now, and I didn't really like what I had to say, so I'm just quickly redoing this a little bit. And what happened was, in the previous recording, I went on to talk through a bunch of different options and ideas that would basically change up some of the ways allies functioned, or, get punished or rewarded in slightly different ways for different cards. And I think it was interesting, but I don't think I said enough that I think it should be optional, because I think the way the game works now, the way it's worked for years, the way allies have functioned within it, it's too deeply set into the DNA of the game and people's experiences with it. So obviously, I think any ways that might change that up should be optional, things like permanent setup modulars that change things up, or an optional game mode, things like that. And some of my ideas were as simple as reduce the ally limits, you couldn't flood the board quite as much, or increase the cost of each ally after the first one you played. Some of them were, very similar to Mr. Sinister, how he gets extra threat added on for status cards being put onto him. What if when you blocked with an ally, you had to add threat to the main scheme, or take damage, something like that, little things. There are, conversely, on the opposite side, there are things like boosting up other card types to kind of compete with allies. But I think that's so difficult because allies are not only overly efficient, I would say, as you may have seen in the video, but extremely versatile and extremely consistent. And I don't necessarily think everything should quite be there. But that was the gist of it. I think my favorite idea I talked about was a very sort of Magic the Gathering Hearthstone. A lot of games do it where when you play an ally, it comes in exhausted. So they would keep all their efficiency, but their tempo would get hit. And I think that puts most of them actually in a pretty good place as they were maybe perhaps sort of intended to be. Again, just an assumption on that, but that's kind of what I thought. So long story short is I don't think any one solution would perfectly balance allies. I think you'd have to hit them on multiple fronts, and I think it would have to be optional. And it's totally okay just to keep the game the way it is, the way we all enjoy it. If you're watching this video, you like Marvel Champions, so do I. And allies, I think I already said this in the video, but they are my favorite card type. I really like the way they interact with so many different parts of the game. One card that can do multiple things, yeah, it's strong, but that's so much fun to use. That kind of brings us to the end here. I hope that was interesting. If you didn't know, allies were really, really powerful. I mean, this is just my opinion, my little breakdown here with some kind of numbers. That's my interpretation overall, but I think they are phenomenally strong. And if you're struggling with a scenario and you're not sure what kind of cards to include, throw in a few more allies, There's no problem with it. Leadership is all about allies. It's really fun. It's a completely valid way to play. I don't want people to say, oh, you shouldn't be playing allies, playing too many allies, not valid. It's completely valid. It's just really, really good. And I'd like to see other cards kind of compete more with that, just in a general kind of sense, for many, many reasons. And that was kind of the point of this. Do allies need to change? I don't think they need to. Are they more powerful than I would like? Yes. Are there possible solutions that could help that as optional kind of measures that wouldn't affect people who don't want that? Yes. So I'm Villain Fury. This has been my look at the strongest card type in Marvel Champions, allies, and thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed it, like, comment, subscribe, check out the Discord, check out Into the AM, check out Patreon, check out anything you like. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.